Thank you. Hi, everybody. I hope you had a good lunch. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit. It's a quick session, 30 minutes, about if you're coming in, it's a fairly introductory session, but if you're coming in from desktop development, or if you're looking at just website development, you want to get into the space of doing a web app, right? What's this thing between website and web app? And I'm going to explore a couple of issues. First of all, a little introduction, right? Movies, movie theater. So there's going to be a few slides around. Blue pill versus red pill, right? There are a lot of people on the web, very smart people who have very different opinions about website versus web app, right? Your app should be more webby or more appy, right? My take, based on kind of direct experience I've had with enterprises or third-party developers who wanted to start exploring web apps. Coming from BlackBerry, we have a lot of developers who are used to a Java platform, and they're looking at this web as this new thing, right? And so when they look at it, there's really some clear patterns that they see in the market. Users out there have been conditioned to a particular life cycle. They go to a store, there's a trust relationship going on. They download something, it gets installed on their home screen. Then they click on it, they launch it, they expect it to take the whole screen. And they expect the applications to have some behaviors in terms of integrating with their devices. So that's really at a very high level. We can talk about very fancy 3D games and quality of graphics and so on. But in terms of core experience with the end users, this application lifecycle and this device integration is very important. So I'm taking kind of an approach that says, hey, you want to do an app, but fundamentally your end users don't care. Web is good enough today to do a really large portion of applications using web technologies. So users don't care what's inside, so let's use web technologies. And there are really a lot of ways to make that journey, right? We talk about content, and there's really emerging web technologies like WebGL and Canvas and accelerated graphics. You can do some pretty amazing things, pretty strong visual things. And then there is the life cycle part of the story. How can I get my web content actually hosted on an app store? How can I take advantage of that infrastructure and making sure that it works? So this is no secret that we have a strong partnership at RIM with the Apache Cordova project. So we're investing people. We have our own technology called WebWorks, which is, at the end of the day, Apache Cordova for BlackBerry, right? Apache Cordova is the new name for the PhoneGap project. So this idea of taking web content, packaging it, is something that's very powerful. Not only does it give you the tools to start doing application-like things, but it also gives you that kind of trusted shell where you can get access to device APIs and functionality on your device. The key thing, over and over again, I say no to nibs, right? There's a lot of people that native is better. And James had the presentation earlier today where that's true, there are APIs, right? Native will always be a couple of steps ahead of the game. But fundamentally, today you can look at a lot of applications and they can certainly be done using web technologies. My favorite sport, I get to a lot of kind of enterprise customers, and they show me a native app, and literally it's a page flip, it's a nice transition, and they go, you can't do that on web. And within 10 minutes, I can put a little bit of CSS on a good platform with hardware acceleration, and they get the same type of level of accelerated graphics of visuals. So there's a lot of lack of knowledge and misunderstanding in the field about truly the power of the web. People set the bar pretty low in terms of what the web can do, and pretty generally, we can surpass that really well. But make no mistake, right? There are a lot of little internal wars. Is it this framework or that framework, that platform versus that platform? The competition to the web is the native experience. And we have to keep on pushing further and further. It's very important to push the boundaries in terms of device access, rich media access, and all the things that James has talked about a little bit earlier. So from what I'm going to talk about, what are kind of the basic, simple things when you want to get started? What does it mean to do a web app? Well, I think the first thing is you're kind of thinking about a single-page app metaphor. And even if under the covers you can go from one page to the next, that's fine. You just mask it, right? This concept of navigation from one environment to another is fairly transparent to app users, but fairly obvious to web users. And so this is something that you want to deal with. And there are lots of frameworks out there, lots of techniques to help you do that in a fairly seamless way. The next thing that's very important, and I'm always surprised about how many traps people can fall into, is the fact that you don't have browser Chrome. You don't have the back button. Your navigation model is quite different, right? There are a number of sites, I won't name the names, but where you can actually paint yourself in a corner, and the only way to get out is to go back to a menu or to the home page. You cannot go back to your previous state. And this is a fairly fundamental kind of cool thing about the web. Another issue is browser events. I'll show you some interesting things about how touch and click interplay on some platforms. And then finally is viewport management. A lot of material has been written about this. I'm just going to summarize kind of the key points. So let's start with the viewport. What's happening here? The biggest issue is that with the advent of high-density screens, the notion of a pixel has changed. Right? The desktop viewport is pretty much WYSIWYG. You have a screen of 1600 by 1200. That's your resolution. When you maximize your browser, these are the pixels that you actually have access to using your application. On mobile, however, it's a whole other story. Typically, what you have is you have effects of zooming. You have effects of a viewport on a larger canvas, not a HTML5 canvas, but a larger painting surface that the browser is using. And your users are expected to kind of pan and zoom around to find their content. So pixels are fundamentally no longer display relevant, right? And the key challenge that people have had is how do you make sure that you can take advantage of high resolution but not break the web? This is one of the reasons, for example, on the iPhone, started with 320 pixels. People have started to build websites with taking that width as an assumption, and now you have a Retina display. You should have 640 pixels because it's double both in width and height. But logically, for your application, your viewport is still essentially 320 pixels. So the key measure that you work with on an everyday basis is the CSS pixels, right? That's what you use when you specify things in your style sheets. This is when you use inline dimensions in HTML. You should always use style sheets, not do inline CSS stuff anymore. And then obviously in media query. On desktop, as I said, a CSS pixel is essentially equal to one device pixel, right? On mobile, don't even try, right? The device vendor basically tell you what a logical pixel is, and that's really how you work. The notion of a physical device pixel is something that you don't really have access to. It still matters, like we've seen in terms of high-resolution pictures and how they get rendered on a display like the Retina display. But fundamentally, when you build your app and you think about your layouts, that's not something that you have to think about. So really, you deal with abstract pixels from the get on. On BlackBerry, our default is 160 dpi. And then you can do the math on the screen size and the actual resolution that you get out of that. That's a big issue, right? I mean, here are several JavaScript APIs to get width or heights of something, measurements, right? Screen, again, a very desktop-y concept, because your window could be minimized or just have the screen, but the screen tells you how big it could be if you maximized. On mobile, your application takes the full screen. The size of your window is essentially the size of the screen, right? Then you have the document get element, client width and client height. And that's essentially what you're using. This is what's your usable space, minus whatever portion the Chrome takes. So generally, it's in height. There are no mobile browsers that I know of that take Chrome on the sides, on the width of a page. They're generally at the top or at the bottom or both. And here, you'll get a different result to take into account that extra room of the, of the Chrome. When you look at window, inner width, and inner height, basically, again, that's the CSS pixel, but for the viewport. And so that's basically dependent on your level of zoom. And that's what your end user is actually seeing, right? And then page X offset and page Y offset is where you are within your scrolling. That's pretty much standard. That doesn't change. So You've probably seen that piece of code a lot, but one of the first things when someone looks at taking web content and make it happen on a web app, right? I want to take full control of the screen. I want to take full control of my layout. I want to remove a pinch zoom type of logic so that I really own the whole page. So basically, that's the MetaTag viewport, and you have height, device height, width, device width, and so on. Some people sometimes get surprised that this is not the magic bullet. If you have content, for example, and you create a table, and you have a width of the table that surpasses that, you get the same behavior you get on a desktop browser. You're going to start having content that goes over the screen, and the browser kind of behavior is going to kick in and create a panning right and left or top and down, depending on that content. So you have to make sure that the content that you generate is in line within your different dimensions. So typically, you want to deal in percent rather than absolute pixels, unless you're developing for a single device. But if you do web, you kind of don't want to do that. Another very useful concept are the media queries. So that allows you to customize your CSS, basically, making some assumption about some screen size. So you can have something that's fairly narrow. You can have something that's fairly wide. You have orientation support, so you can do portrait versus landscape. And this gives you a lot of control on how you're actually going to build your app and assume particular layouts based on your devices. Another thing that's also very important is orientation. A lot of sites, a lot of properties, especially games, kind of break when you change orientation. So the good news is, if you take the package app type of approach with something like Apache Cordova or the BlackBerry WebWorks platforms, you can actually, there are flags, there are native APIs that are shown through the packager, so you can actually lock the orientation. You can query the orientation. You can do a lot of interesting things. But mostly it's proprietary, right? What you want is the upcoming screen orientation API that I've been kind of stuck for a long time into Never Never Land. But this is kind of what it looks like. You have screen orientation that's a read-only variable, and you basically understand if it's a portrait or landscape, and you could act according to that. There's also the ability to lock or unlock your particular orientation. One of the things that gets interesting, if you go into the W3C page where that API is discussed, there's a lot of concern about security. You could use those APIs to basically lock a user's device, because you could constantly basically go change orientation, right? You just write a JavaScript loop, you set a timeout so that you call yourself over and over again, and you constantly change from portrait to landscape back to portrait. The browser UI is going to start moving around, and chances are users are going to have a hard time to actually get out of that. So there are interesting conversations going on about how powerful this API should be. Should you have spam filtering so that if it happens more than X amount of time within that, that amount of actual time, within 10 seconds, then it would get blocked, or user would get prompted. So there's a lot of interesting things here around how you think about your viewport, orientation, and so on. Next thing I want to talk about is events. And one thing that's always fascinated me when I started to do mobile development is that your screen is essentially shared between the browser logic and your application. When you do a pinch zoom, that's the browser taking over the UI for the page and acting on the layout of the page. Same with swipes. So really, the issue is that fundamentally right now, the World Wide Web is the Wild Wild West. There are actually slightly different behaviors back and forth and different ways of dealing with the events. Some of the top platforms do touch really well. Some others don't. And some others do a mix of touch and click. There are devices like the BlackBerry where actually you can see a little mouse cursor once you start using the trackpad. So your application is constantly in this dual mode of a mouse kind of metaphor and also a touch metaphor. And that could be quite interesting. There's also with prevent default. So prevent default, I'll show you some more details, basically says that, I've captured the event, now I want to do my own thing, browser, stop messing around with it. Right? And one of the things that I was faced with is that there were actually pieces of the UI on a client project that it was the same on mobile and on desktop. And so they had to build code that dynamically could respond both to clicks and touch events. So This is a very simplified picture, right? But kind of gives you a little sense of what's going on, right? User puts their finger on a page, on a screen, and what happens? Typically, your mileage may vary, but you're going to get a touch start event, and if within 300 milliseconds or 250 milliseconds, different platforms use a slightly different timeout. If nothing happens, then that's going to now get to a mouse down event. And the browser is basically going to convert that touch event into a mouse event. And basically, the timing is because, again, the browser is essentially fighting with the application in terms of owning the user interaction on the page, on the glass. So they have to wait a little bit to make sure you're not starting to do a pinch move, or you're not starting to do a swipe, right? In which case, that's going to be back to touch events, and we're not going to start sending click events to the page. So delay is slightly different. The interplay between touch and mouse event vary. So in some cases, when touch move starts happening, the same rule has to happen. If you actually have a touch handler, then, a click handler or a mouse handler, that event will be converted and sent out as a click event, or a mouse move, or a mouse up, and then a mouse click events. So that's the key thing, right? One of the key things, again, is this fighting going on between the browser UX and your application. And sometimes, you just want to control your own destiny, right? So one of the things we have, unfortunately, this is BlackBerry only right now, but we're looking at the other solutions as part of the STEM discussion, is we actually have a couple of meta tags that allow you to customize that type of behavior. You are in control, you own your application, and you're telling the browser what you expect them to do. So it's touch event mode, and native event says it's only touch, nothing else. User touch the screen, touch event is raised, done. Your application owns the touch event from there on. There is another mode, which is pure with mouse conversion, so it's a little bit wordy. But basically what happens is the user touches the screen, there's a touch events that raise, but the browser checks if there's actually an on-touch event handler that occurs. If not, immediately, it starts generating a click event. So you don't have that 300 milliseconds anymore, but you have kind of an automated conversion of touch to clicks. Again, for content, I've been surprised by how much content is simply repurposed between a traditional desktop environment and mobile. And people use jQuery and Dojo and whatever, and they have on-click events everywhere. To start transforming that and changing that into touch events, it's complicated. So for a lot of people in this room, this may sound a little bit like heresy, but in the field, people actually get to do those things because they don't have a lot of time. And there's a lot of assets already around click events. So, and of course, right, as you do that, all the browser UX stuff, so pinch zoom, double tap to zoom in, text selection, context menus, all those types of things that are really part of the browser UX are no longer happening. So you basically have to take ownership of all those things if these are the things that your application needs. So here I'm showing you a very simple example, 10 lines of code that I wrote to kind of help an application that was out there, where basically we say we control the destiny. Let me handle, so I don't have the meta tag on a lot of those platforms. I'm actually going to handle the touch start, and boom, send it directly to a mouse click. And actually, what I'm doing is a touch end. So yeah, it's a little bit controversial. You're kind of going in, changing the event model, you're intercepting, you're doing the conversion yourself, but in a lot of cases, it's simple and it kind of works, right? So I'm not here after purity. I'm here about just getting some stuff done. So this is kind of code, evil code, but if touch, right, you're going to map. So here I'm mapping on touch end, right? So when the user lifts the finger off, so it kind of matched to a mouse up, right, on a desktop world and generates the click. Event prevent default, first thing, boom, blocks the further processing of the event chain by the browser. And basically what you do now is you're going to do a little bit of conversion. You got an event that matched a touch event. And you basically have change touches. So this is multi-touch. So you can have multiple entries, but here we're taking a simple case of just one. And you're just going to map it to the client X and client Y, which typically come from the click events. And then you're just forwarding, you're just calling the click handler on the event that was the original target for the touch event. So these are very simple, a few lines of code, and your app may require to do something else. Maybe you already know the type of events or the type of actions, and you want to wire that directly. Maybe you want to follow how the browser distributes the events. So you don't want to check if that particular event has a click. Maybe a parent has a click, or a parent of a parent. You have to do that homework to basically find out where the click is eventually handled, right? Because you've prevent default. So you're in control now. You own the whole thing. And there are other virtual event translations that happen. So last weekend, I was in Berlin, and someone had a HTML5 game, mostly for desktop, that basically used the arrow keys. And they basically had a document on key up, and based on the arrow keys, they moved the little characters up and down. Guess what? On a lot of mobile devices, you don't have arrow keys on the actual virtual keyboards. So a quick and dirty solution was to take the device orientation. So if you tilt it top or bottom, right or left, it would actually push key events and call the on key up that the developer had for their game. And so it was a very crude, very simple way of getting playability. It actually worked fairly well, of a game where you still had code in there that responded to key up on, on the up arrow, down arrow, left arrow, and right arrow. Another example, famous frameworks, right, like jQuery Mobile, has a whole virtualized event system to deal with these differences between touch and mouse, and especially deal with the differences across all sorts of devices. So when the rubber meets the road, and you want to have control and build your app, this is something that you have to take on. Another thing that a lot of people don't know about is there's a little-known property in CSS called user select. And user select is another mechanism to prevent basically a selection to happen. So there's nothing more annoying if you do a game, for example, and the user starts putting two fingers, and suddenly you have the browser UI to actually do a text selection. Or you'll have the highlighting that occurs, right, to show that something has been highlighted for selection, for copy-paste, or whatever. So you can do that at the level of the body. Obviously, you can do that at a lower level on the individual elements. So you have a lot of control for that. Next topic is the browser Chrome. That's an interesting one. A lot of people get trapped by that. You don't realize how much the browser skin does for you until you don't have it anymore. We're so dependent on the back button, for example, that suddenly when we don't have it, we can get a little bit lost. There are famous sites out there where, as I said earlier, you can paint yourself into a corner and you don't have anywhere to go back unless you hit the back button. Right? And you bring that on a mobile device, you bring that into a full screen mode, and the only way out you have is to go back to the home page. And how about navigation, right? I mean, this is the thing. I talk a lot about going web apps versus websites, but it doesn't mean that I want to get rid of all the good things that the web has. I think this notion of links, of having this application state, and you get to save it, and you get to come back wherever you want, is fantastic, right? There's pieces of work like web intent that allow you to even go across applications and set all this type of content. But if you think of bookmarks like saved application states, right? Why wouldn't you give that to your users? Right? If you followed good REST principles, even though you don't have Chromes, your page still has URLs. You can still use the hashtag. You can still have a lot of information available, use the history APIs, and so on. So for some application, that may be pretty cool to basically save bookmarks. And you can reuse browser infrastructure, web infrastructure to do that, even though you are within the context of a web app. And for debugging, so we have a very good debugger on BlackBerry. We can do a web inspector remotely and the full feature thing. But one thing that was useful is the reload button when you're testing, developing. Right? So this is a very simple call. that I did not know a year ago, but location.reload true. And you can put a little button or something, just call that API and you can reload your page so that you can do debugging in an iterative fashion. So this is not quite navigation, but it's still within that browser Chrome that allows you to refresh pages, go back, and so on. So I figured I'd put it in. So conclusion, right? Web apps are different than websites. There are things you can do, right? If you subscribe to that idea, then you start to have to take ownership of your viewport. You may have to take ownership of your events. Navigation is different, but don't lose that. It's one of the key super things about the web, right? I hate it when I'm in an application and I can't jump to another application easily, right? Forget links within an application, right? Links across applications are so complicated to do in native. Right? This is an area where the web can really do something really cool with things like web intent. Right? But within your application, if you keep abiding to REST principles and you keep managing your bookmarks and your URLs, even though it's not visible to your end users, there's a lot of infrastructure that's available to you to do cool things. And debugging is hard, of course, unless you're on a BlackBerry. From BB7 all the way to our latest devices, you have Remote Web Inspector. You plug it in on a network, you plug it in with USB, you have real-time, complete use of Web Inspector against your page running on the device. So this gives you complete the timeline, DOM, traversal, JavaScript, everything. That's it. Thank you. Any questions? Okay. I'm assuming that is a possibility, yeah. Or I can give it to you on a USB key. That's easy as well. And we have some cookies, so if someone can name 4 of the films that were quickly shown on the slides, then you get a special cookie that we brought in. Could be really hard. Hellraiser is the easy one. Okay? So come to me after the talk. Okay? Thank you so much.